I'll tell you the thing I've never told anyone first, because this story doesn't make sense without it. On a Wednesday night in February of 2009, I was planning to kill myself. I'm going to say that plainly because I think the plainness is important. I was 23 years old, I was living in Portland, Oregon. I had been unemployed for 4 months during the worst economic collapse in a generation. I had just ended a relationship that had been the primary architecture of my emotional life for 3 years, and I was dealing with a depression that I had not named or sought treatment for, and that had been quietly eating the foundation of everything I thought I was for the better part of 2 years. I was in the specific place that people who have been there will recognize. Not dramatic, not loud, just a complete and exhausted absence of reasons to continue. The decision felt less like a decision and more like the final acknowledgement of something that had already been determined. I had a plan. I had settled on a bridge. I had, with the terrible, methodical clarity that a certain kind of depression produces, worked out the details in the way that you work out any practical problem. I left my apartment that night with my keys and my phone and nothing else, because there was no reason to take anything else. I don't talk about this often. I've talked about it with therapists, one very close friend, and briefly with my wife. Writing it down for strangers feels strange, and also somehow right, because the point of this story is not the darkness. The point of this story is what happened on the way. I was walking. It was cold and raining in the particular relentless way that Portland in February knows how to be. I was on Burnside, heading west, and I was not looking at anything in particular. I was inside my own head in a way that meant the external world was just a texture, not a place. The wet pavement and the headlights of passing cars and the sound of rain, all of it was just backdrop. There was a man sitting in the recessed doorway of a closed business. He had a sleeping bag and a cardboard setup that indicated this was his regular spot, his organized space in the way that people who live outside often organize their immediate surroundings with great care because it is the one thing they can control. He had a small battery-powered lantern. He was reading a book. He looked up as I walked past and said with no particular urgency, "Hey man, you doing okay?" I stopped. I don't know why I stopped. I think the honest answer is that I had not been spoken to in 3 days, and the simple human direction of it, someone addressing me as though I existed and my existence was a matter of interest to them, cut through whatever insulation I'd built up around myself. I said I was fine. This is what you say. He looked at me for a moment with the kind of eyes that have seen a lot of weather, human and otherwise. He said, "You want to sit for a minute? I got an extra cup." He had a thermos. He poured me coffee into a paper cup that he produced from a plastic bag with the hospitality of someone who has decided that whatever they have enough to share. I sat down on the wet concrete next to his doorway and took the coffee and held it. We talked for, I genuinely don't know. It felt like 20 minutes. It might have been an hour. I don't remember the full content of the conversation, and I'm not sure the content was the point anyway. I remember that he told me his name was Walter. I remember he was from Spokane originally. I remember he was reading a thick paperback fantasy novel, and he held it up at some point and said that books were the best shelter there was, because they took you somewhere completely else. And he said this with a kind of cheerful conviction that struck me as one of the braver things I'd ever heard. I remember that at some point I started crying. Not dramatic crying, the quiet kind, the kind that starts before you decide to let it. And I was embarrassed, and he didn't make me feel embarrassed. He just let it be there and handed me a paper napkin from his plastic bag and said very simply, "Whatever it is, man, it's going to move. Things move. That's the one thing I know for sure." I sat with him until I was cold enough that my body overrode my brain and insisted on being somewhere warm. I told him thank you, and he told me to take care of myself like he actually meant it as instruction, not farewell. I walked home. I did not go to the bridge. The next morning, I called a crisis line, not because I was in immediate crisis anymore, but because something had shifted enough that I could recognize I needed a next step, and the crisis line was the only number I had that fit. The person I talked to helped me find a therapist. The therapist I started seeing 2 weeks later was the first of several over the years, and that chain of professional support is a significant part of why I'm here writing this. But the chain started with a man in a doorway on Burnside who had an extra cup. I went back the next 2 nights hoping to find Walter and thank him more specifically than I had managed in my compromised state. He wasn't there either time. His sleeping bag and lantern and organized cardboard were gone. Someone at a nearby shelter told me they knew a Walter who sometimes stayed there, older guy from Spokane, but that he moved around and they hadn't seen him in a few weeks. I looked in the low-effort way that you look when you're 23 and newly in therapy and still reconstructing basic functioning. I asked at a couple of shelters. I went back to the doorway a few more times. Nothing. And then life, as it does, started moving forward, and the urgency of the search faded, even though the gratitude didn't. I got better. That is the abbreviated version of the next several years, and I'm aware of its inadequacy. I stayed in therapy. I got back into the workforce slowly, first in a barista job, then a warehouse job, then, through a connection I made at the warehouse, an entry-level position at a logistics startup that turned out to be the beginning of a real career. I moved through my mid-20s and into my 30s with the specific appreciation for ordinary stability that I think only people who have stood at the edge of its absence can fully feel. The regular Tuesday, the unremarkable Thursday, the accumulation of ordinary days, I have never once taken those for granted. I met my wife Danny in 2014 at a friend's housewarming. I told her about the bridge and about Walter on our 5th date, which some people would consider too soon and which felt to me like necessary honesty. She listened without moving and then asked 3 questions, all of them good. She has that quality of asking the questions that actually matter. I knew fairly quickly after that. We married in 2016. We have 2 kids now, a daughter who is 6 and a son who is 4, and who are, without any qualification or caveat, the reason my life feels like the most improbable gift. Every time my daughter laughs at something that's only funny to her, every time my son falls asleep in the car with his head at an impossible angle, I think about the Wednesday night in February and the slight randomness of a man looking up from a book. I never stopped thinking about Walter. That's the honest thing. He moved to a background frequency rather than a foreground one, but he was always there. On certain anniversaries, I always remembered the date, February 11th, I would think about him specifically. On the days that my life felt the most rich and most real, he would surface. I wanted him to know. That was the persistent, specific feeling. Not obligation exactly, more like an incompleteness, like a story that was told to everyone except the person who deserved to hear it most. In 2021, I started looking seriously. I had more resources than I'd had at 23, a stable income, time I could allocate deliberately, access to people who knew things I didn't. I also had a better understanding of how to look for someone who exists outside the normal documentary infrastructure of housed life. I started with what I knew. His name was Walter. He was from Spokane. He was probably in his 50s in 2009, which would make him in his late 60s or early 70s now. He had been in Portland. He read fantasy novels with the commitment of a person who had a relationship with books, not just with passing time. I contacted 3 outreach organizations in Portland that worked with people experiencing homelessness. I explained what I was trying to do, not to a junior staff member, but in writing to directors with enough detail about the circumstances to make clear I was not a threat. I explained that I was looking for a man named Walter from Spokane who had been in the Burnside area in the winter of 2009, and my reasons for looking were entirely and solely gratitude. 2 organizations were warm but unhelpful. They understandably couldn't share information about clients, and the time frame was too distant. The 3rd organization, a small nonprofit doing street outreach on the east side, had a longtime outreach worker named Brenda who called me personally after reading my letter. She said she couldn't give me information directly, but she said she could ask around. She said she'd been doing street outreach in Portland for 19 years, and she knew a lot of people's stories, and that someone like the person I was describing,
A reader from Spokane who had been a consistent presence in a particular area was the kind of person the longtime community remembered. She called me back 11 days later. She said there was a man who might match. She had spoken to him. She had described the situation in general terms, a person who'd had a significant encounter in that area in 2009 and was looking to reconnect. She said he had listened quietly and then asked one question. He asked what the person looked like. She described me as best she could from what I'd told her, young white guy, dark coat, crying in the rain. And she said there was a silence on his end, and then he said, "Yeah, I think I remember." I should tell you that by 2022, Walter was no longer living on the street. This was the thing Brenda told me that broke me open a little before she finished the sentence. He had been housed since 2017 through a permanent supportive housing program, a small apartment in a building managed by the same nonprofit Brenda worked with. He was 68 years old. He had some health challenges that he was managing. He had a caseworker he trusted, in a community he was part of, in a small apartment that was, by all accounts, full of books. Brenda, with his permission, gave me his address. She told me he had said I could come. She said, and this made me laugh and cry simultaneously, that he had said to tell me he still had good coffee. I drove to Portland from where I live now, in Seattle, on a Saturday morning in March of last year. I'd been awake since 4. Danny had packed me food for the drive that I didn't eat and had hugged me for a long time at the door and said simply, "Tell him thank you from me too." I had a certified check in my jacket pocket. I had been putting money aside for 2 years in an account I opened specifically for this purpose. The amount was $47,000, which represented what I could genuinely afford to give without affecting my family in any way I wasn't comfortable with. I was aware that this number was arbitrary, that there is no dollar amount that translates correctly into what I was trying to express. I had thought about this a great deal and landed on the conclusion that the amount was less important than the sincerity of what it represented, and that I would let him do whatever he wanted with it. Keep it, give it away, use it for books, ignore it entirely. It was not a transaction. It was the only language I had that was large enough to carry what I meant. His building was a clean, well-maintained 6-story in a residential neighborhood. His apartment was on the 3rd floor. I stood in the hallway outside his door for longer than I'm going to admit, and then I knocked. He answered within 30 seconds. He was older than the version of him I'd held in my memory for 15 years. That should be obvious, but it landed as a distinct fact. He was a big man, had always been a big man, I thought, with white hair now and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He was wearing a flannel shirt, and there was a book open on the table behind him, face down to hold his place, which told me the habit had survived everything. We looked at each other. He said, "You look better than the last time." I laughed. It was involuntary and genuine, and it broke the moment open in the best possible way. I'm not going to reconstruct the full conversation, because it was 2 hours long, and most of it belongs to that room and to the two of us. I will tell you that he remembered more than I expected. Not everything, but the texture of it, the cold and the rain, and a young guy who was clearly not okay. He said he thought about that night sometimes too over the years. He said he never knew what happened to me, and that he had hoped, in the way you hope about strangers, that whatever it was had worked out. I told him what it had worked out into. My job, my wife, my kids. The ordinary Tuesday that I love unreasonably. I showed him pictures of my daughter and son on my phone, and he studied them with great seriousness and said my son had a face that suggested he was going to be funny, and on the basis of 4 years of available evidence, I told him he was absolutely right. I told him what that night had been, what I had been planning. I told him plainly, the way I'd learned to tell it in therapy, not as drama, just as truth. He was quiet for a while after that. He looked at his hands. He said, "I didn't know it was that bad." I told him it didn't matter whether he knew. It mattered that he looked up. I gave him the envelope with the check when I was leaving. I told him what it was, and I told him it wasn't an attempt to equate anything, that I knew it didn't equate anything, and that he should use it however he wanted or not at all, and it wouldn't change anything about what I'd already gotten from him, which was everything. He held the envelope for a moment without opening it and looked at me, and I could see him working through something, and then he nodded once the way people nod when they've decided to accept something gracefully. He walked me to the door. In the hallway, he put his hand briefly on my shoulder, and I thought about a pickup truck and a 9-year-old boy and how the small gestures are always the ones that stay. And he said, "You go home to those kids." I did. I drove back to Seattle, in the kind of silence that is full rather than empty, and I stopped once at a rest area to cry in a way that was not sad at all, and then I drove the rest of the way home. Walter used part of the money to buy a better recliner, which he told me about in the first of what have become occasional letters, actual physical letters, because he prefers them and because I have discovered that I do too. He used another portion to donate to the outreach nonprofit where Brenda works. He told me he wanted it to go somewhere that might do for someone else what a cup of coffee in a doorway did for me. And if that isn't the most elegant thing I've ever heard, then I don't know what is. He is doing okay. That is the current and truest report. He is reading, he is in his apartment with his books and his community and his better recliner. And he is okay. I have a photograph from that Saturday in March. Brenda took it on my phone as I was leaving the building, Walter and me on the front steps, squinting into the early spring sun. I have it framed on my desk. My daughter asked me once who the man in the picture is, and I told her he was one of the most important people in my life. And she accepted this with the complete and uncomplicated trust of a 6-year-old and went back to whatever she was doing. I think about what I would say to the 23-year-old walking on Burnside in the rain if I could reach back to him. I think I would say, "You are going to be okay in ways you cannot currently imagine." I would say, "Stay." I would say, "There is a man in a doorway about to look up from his book, and that moment is going to ripple forward into a life that you would not trade for anything, and all you have to do is still be here for it." I am still here for it. Every ordinary Tuesday, every impossible Friday, every morning my son climbs into bed between me and Danny, and my daughter protests from her room that it isn't fair, and the dog barks at nothing in the backyard, and the coffee is brewing downstairs, and the whole improbable daily fact of it is so full, I sometimes just have to stop and hold it for a second. Walter knew the one thing he said he knew for sure. Things move. They moved. They moved into this.